Welcome back to the philosophy of religion. Let's begin with a question. Should there be a presumption of atheism, theism, or agnosticism? And by that, what is meant is, on the question of God's existence, which of these positions should we start out by presuming before we undertake a consideration of the evidence for and against? Well, you already know that I'm agnostic. I rather gave the game away in the first of this week's podcasts. And on the back of that, it would be reasonable to assume that I'm going to argue that we should presume agnosticism. After all, in philosophy of religion, it does tend to be the case that theists argue in favour of theism, atheists argue in favour of atheism, so it would seem reasonable to suppose that an agnostic would argue in favour of agnosticism, or at least try to defend an agnostic position. But I'm not going to do that. In fact, what I'm going to end up doing is suggesting that there's something deeply problematic with the way I ended up an agnostic. So how did I end up there? Well, when I was growing up, God and religion were not discussed around the home. And by that, I don't mean it was one of those topics that one just didn't discuss, that it was off limits. No, I just mean that it wasn't discussed. It just didn't come up. So I certainly wasn't pushed in one direction or another. There really wasn't much to nudge me one way over another either. At school, I sang the hymns I was told to sing, read the Bible passages I was told to read, listened to the stories I was told to listen to. But I can't say any of it made much impact on me. I took religious studies at GCSE and A-level, and although I was aware that some of the teachers were religious, deeply religious in some cases, they were also scrupulous in just delivering the curriculum and not trying to win students over to their own position. So, if you'd asked me up to about the age of 17 or 18 what my position was on the God question, I'm not sure I'd have been able to answer it. I doubt I would have said that I was agnostic because I'm not sure I even knew what the word meant back then. I suppose agnosticism is a fair description of the position I had, because I neither believed that there was a God nor believed that there isn't. But it was a sort of accidental agnosticism, as I really just hadn't given any thought to the matter. Anyway, once I discovered philosophy at university, I became very, very interested in the issue of God's existence, utterly fascinated by it. And this led me to work through lots of different arguments for God's existence, and lots of different variations of those arguments, as well as lots of arguments against God's existence. And this took years, the whole of my first degree and a bit of time after that. And at the end of all that, the conclusion I came to was that none of the arguments, whether for or against, were persuasive. So I suspended judgment, and it's around this time that I started referring to myself as an agnostic. And nothing much has changed over the years. I'm still very interested in the God question. I've continued to look at more arguments for and against. I even published a book of them a couple of years ago. But my position hasn't changed. None of the arguments have swayed me, and I still neither believe in God nor disbelieve. So that's a little about how I ended up as agnostic. Although I'd still describe myself as such, I'm not going to defend this position or the way in which I arrived at it, which, as I say, I now find very problematic. So let's now turn to our question. Should we presume atheism, theism, or agnosticism? Well, the inspiration for this question is a well-known paper by Anthony Flew, who was a famous philosopher of religion in the second half of the 20th century. The paper is entitled The Presumption of Atheism, and it was published in 1972. I'm going to spend a bit of time outlining Flew's position in this paper before moving on to give my thoughts on it. Now, Flew himself was an advocate of atheism for much of his life. Near the end of his life, he claimed to have changed his mind, openly endorsed deism, and wrote a book explaining why. Or rather, he co-wrote it. There was some controversy about this, with some suspecting that the book was really the work of the co-author, and that Flew was in such serious mental decline at that point that he had in effect been duped into allowing his name to be put onto the book. Flew actually denied that. But in any case, his essay on the presumption of atheism from 1972 has become something of a classic, and also very influential. About a decade ago, it was claimed that one of the most common justifications for atheism now was the presumption of atheism. In other words, that it's now common for people to argue that we should presume atheism, make it the default position, and only give it up if strong, positive evidence is presented in favour of the existence of God. And this is quite curious, really, because it's not what Flew was arguing. Flew was actually advocating for something much closer to what we would call agnosticism. Early on in his paper, he draws a distinction between positive atheism and negative atheism. Positive atheism is where someone positively asserts that there is no God. Negative atheism, on the other hand, applies to those who just aren't theists. And agnostics would seem to fall into that category, because they clearly aren't theists, and they clearly aren't atheists either, as they no more positively assert that there is a God than they positively assert that there isn't one. And when Flew argued that we should presume atheism, he suggested that we should presume negative atheism. In other words, our starting position should be neither to affirm nor deny the existence of God. And as others have noted, what Flew appears to be advocating is in fact a presumption of agnosticism. And certainly those who've used his argument to defend positive atheism, the positive assertion that there is no God, have either misunderstood or misapplied his argument. Anyway, for the remainder of this discussion, I don't want to use the terms positive atheism and negative atheism. I'd rather use theism, atheism, and agnosticism. So we've got three positions then. There's theism, which is the positive assertion that there is a God. There's atheism, which is the positive assertion that there is no God. And then there's agnosticism, a suspension of judgment, where one neither positively asserts that there is a God nor that there isn't. What Flew suggests, in the way that I and others have read him, is that we should adopt a presumption of agnosticism. Now, to understand what is meant by this, it would help to draw a distinction between assumption and presumption. To assume something is to suppose it, usually without any proof or reason. So if I'm discussing the cosmological argument with someone, I might say, let's assume that the universe had a beginning. In saying that, I'm supposing, for the sake of argument, that the universe had a beginning. But I don't offer any evidence or reason for it, and I'm not committing myself to it. So here, my assumption is no more than a supposition. And in other cases, an assumption is tantamount to a guess. So, if I pass a house with an overgrown lawn, I might assume that the person living there hasn't had time to mow the lawn recently. But this is a guess. I've no evidence for that. I'm merely entertaining it as a hypothesis. And others, of course, might make different assumptions, such as that the person living there is ill and so is unable to mow the lawn, or that there is no one living at the house now. Again, there's no evidence or reason for saying these things, and there's no real commitment to the suggestions that are being made. We're just entertaining them. So that's an assumption. A presumption is stronger than this. To presume something is to take something for granted on reasonable grounds. So a presumption involves committing oneself to a position, but only provisionally. And this is because a presumption involves an awareness that the position may have to be given up in the face of further evidence. So a good example here would be the legal presumption of sanity, which says that a defendant is to be presumed sane at the time the alleged offence was committed. Now, there are reasonable grounds for such a presumption. After all, the vast majority of people are sane, and the vast majority of people who break the law are sane. So it's reasonable to presume that the defendant would have been sane at the time the offence was committed. But there's also an awareness that the presumption of sanity may be overturned or defeated in particular cases, such as when the defence successfully claims that the defendant was in fact not in their right mind. And this is the so-called insanity defence. And I think this example works outside of the courtroom too, because when we encounter people, we surely presume that they are sane, unless and until the evidence suggests otherwise. We also have a presumption that the people we meet are telling us the truth. Again, it's reasonable for us to adopt this presumption because most people are truthful most of the time. But as a presumption, it can still be overturned or defeated, such as when we have reason for thinking that a particular person isn't truthful. And for this person, we abandon our presumption of truthfulness and take what they say with a grain of salt. So hopefully the distinction between assuming and presuming is clear. Now, in the matter of whether God exists or not, Flew suggests that there should be a presumption of agnosticism. And what this means is that we should commit ourselves to neither a belief nor a disbelief in God. And just to be clear, he's saying that this should be our starting position. He's not saying that we should aim to stay in this position. In fact, Flew is quick to point out that a presumption of agnosticism does not entail that we should remain agnostic forever. The aim is to start with a presumption of agnosticism and then weigh the evidence, so to speak, which means considering arguments for and against. After doing that, Flew accepts that someone may decide that the arguments in favour of God's existence outweigh the arguments against, in which case agnosticism is overturned or defeated and the person endorses theism. Or vice versa, someone may decide that the arguments against God's existence are the stronger, in which case the presumption of agnosticism is overturned and the person endorses atheism. But of course, another possible outcome is that the presumption of agnosticism always remains in force. After all, someone may examine the arguments for and against God's existence and decide that there isn't sufficient evidence to come down on one side rather than another. And in that case, the person remains agnostic. Though this could still change at any point in the future, if new evidence or arguments come to light, or if the person reconsiders the evidence already available. So in suggesting that we should adopt a presumption of agnosticism, Flew isn't recommending that we adopt a lifelong agnosticism about God's existence. He accepts that some people might end up remaining agnostics, but that's not the goal of his presumption of agnosticism. It's not something we should be aiming for. Now that we know what a presumption of agnosticism involves, let's see why Flew advocates it. I mentioned earlier when explaining the difference between assumptions and presumptions that presumptions are made on reasonable grounds. One might make an assumption without a good reason, but one wouldn't make a presumption without one. And Flew certainly thinks that he has a good reason for his presumption of agnosticism. It all hinges on this claim, that if we make a claim to belief or to knowledge, we must have good grounds for doing so. Or as Flew puts it, it is by reference to this inescapable demand for grounds that the presumption of agnosticism is justified. His entire case rests on that. So if we make a claim to belief or knowledge, we must have good grounds for doing so. His entire case rests on that. And I suspect there's a general principle at work here. A general principle that says our belief should always be justified, always be based on good evidence. That we shouldn't believe something or disbelieve something unless we've got good evidence for it. But Flew doesn't mention this explicitly, right? He doesn't make any explicit reference to a principle of this nature. He just restricts himself to the issue of God's existence. And on that, he says that if we're able to establish that there is a God, then we have to have good grounds for believing that this is indeed so. Unless and until some grounds are produced, we have literally no reason at all for believing. And the same applies if we're to establish that there is no God. We have to have good grounds for disbelieving. And unless and until those grounds are produced, we have literally no reason to disbelieve. Now, by advocating a presumption of agnosticism, what Flew has effectively done is identify precisely where the burden of proof lies. And this is because presumptions imply burdens of proof. So think of the example I used earlier of the presumption of sanity. In a court of law, it's presumed that the defendant was of sound mind at the time of the alleged offence. If this presumption is to be overturned, where does the burden of proof lie? Whose job is it to overturn it? As you probably know, it's up to the defence to overturn the presumption, which they'll try to do by providing evidence that the defendant wasn't of sound mind at the time of the offence. The burden of proof in this case does not lie with the prosecution. It's not the prosecution's job to show that the defendant was of sound mind. They will simply presume it, as will the judge and the jury, unless and until it's shown to be incorrect. And it's the defence's job to show if it's incorrect. So, going back to Flew, if we ought to adopt a presumption of agnosticism, as he says, where does the burden of proof lie? Well, he says it lies with the theist and the atheist. After all, they have taken positive positions on the question of God's existence. So it's up to them to overturn the presumption of agnosticism by providing evidence for or against God's existence. Now, one of the interesting features of Flew's paper is the way he draws a parallel between the presumption of agnosticism and the presumption of innocence that you find in the legal system. By drawing this parallel, some people have construed him as making some kind of argument from analogy. But Flew doesn't present it that way. Instead, he says it will be illuminating to develop the comparison between the two, which suggests to me that he thinks we'll get a better understanding of the presumption of agnosticism if we compare it to the relatively familiar example of the presumption of innocence. So my inclination is to see the comparison as helpful to understanding the position that Flew is trying to outline. I think it's better to see it that way rather than to see it as some kind of argument for Flew's position. So in comparing the two presumptions, I don't think Flew is trying to make any kind of argument. So let's go further into this now. Now I assume, or should that be presume, that we all know what's meant by a presumption of innocence. It just means that for legal purposes, a defendant is presumed to be innocent of committing an offence unless and until proven guilty. Flew makes a great deal out of the comparison with the presumption of innocence, and it is certainly useful in illustrating the key features of a presumption. When we think of the presumption of innocence, we can see that there is a good reason for the presumption. After all, we don't want innocent people convicted. In fact, it's often said that it's better that many guilty people should escape than one innocent person suffer. And it's thinking like this that underpins the presumption of innocence. And we can also see that the presumption can be overturned. In this case, by the prosecution providing evidence of guilt. And we can see that the presumption comes with a burden of proof, which in this case falls on the prosecution. So the defendant enters the court with the presumption of innocence intact, and it's up to the prosecution to overturn that by persuading the court that there is evidence to suggest the defendant is guilty of the charges. So the comparison between Flew's presumption of agnosticism and the legal presumption of innocence is quite useful, but only up to a point. It certainly helps to illustrate the key features of a presumption, that there have to be grounds for it, that it can be overturned, and that it implies a burden of proof. But if you start to think about the comparison for too long, you'll start to see all sorts of ways in which the two presumptions differ from each other. And the comparison has been criticised for that very reason. I don't think we need to worry too much about that, especially since Flew is only really using it because it's a familiar case of presumption. In any case, I think the idea of drawing a parallel between the question of God's existence and courtroom activities is actually quite helpful to illustrate what Flew has in mind. And I think the best way to think of it is on a parallel with what happens in a magistrate's court when a case is tried by a single judge, a district judge. So, on the matter of God's existence, we should think of ourselves, each of us, as being like a district judge who will hear evidence from the prosecution and defence and then have to reach a verdict on the basis of the evidence given. The prosecution and defence would be theists and atheists. And as a judge, there are certain presumptions that we should make. In the case of a real trial with a real defendant, we would presume the innocence and sanity of the defendant, for example. And in the question of God's existence, the presumption Flew wants us to make is agnosticism. That we approach the question with neither a belief in God nor a disbelief in God. And that we maintain that presumption unless and until the evidence forces us to go in one direction over another. I'll say a little more about his decision to draw a comparison between the presumption of agnosticism and the presumption of innocence in a moment. Before I do that, I ought to say a little about what Flew is seeking to achieve by advocating his presumption of agnosticism. Flew is in fact quite open about his aim, which is to put pressure on theists to ensure that whatever beliefs they hold are suitably grounded. His concern is that theists are apt to believe in God's existence for reasons that would not be seen as adequate, even by the theists themselves, if it were a question of anything else. He notes that whether God exists or not is a matter of great importance, because it's not just a matter of life and death, but of eternal life and death. And he says it's scandalous that in a matter of great importance like this, theists reach their position on grounds that they themselves would take to be inadequate in other, more mundane matters. But although most of Flue's paper is about theists, he also indicates that there is a burden of proof on atheists as well, because their belief that there is not a God would have to be suitably grounded every bit as much as that of theists. Now, so far you may think that all this sounds very sensible. Yes, if someone is going to claim that there is a God or that there isn't one, then they should be able to back it up. But you might be wondering, well, okay, what's the standard of proof here? How strong a case do theists and atheists need to put together to overturn the presumption of agnosticism? And here is where Flue's comparison between the presumption of agnosticism and our legal presumption of innocence starts to become quite unhelpful. And this is because the comparison might lead one to think that the standard of proof is the same in both. Now, in our criminal courts, the standard of proof required to defeat the presumption of innocence is really very high. In a criminal court, we require that a charge is proved beyond all reasonable doubt, so that no reasonable person, when presented with the evidence, should have any reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of the charge. Now, that is a very high standard of proof. It's not the highest possible standard of proof. That would actually be to require that a claim is proved beyond all possible doubt. And if you remember from last year, that's the standard of proof that Descartes famously lays down at the start of his Meditations. He says there that he wants to discover what could not possibly be doubted. But many people would say that that's just too high a standard of proof. Virtually none of our beliefs would meet that standard, because it's possible to come up with a sliver of doubt about virtually anything, even if the doubt is frivolous or theoretical. And this is not just too high a standard of proof in the philosophical sphere, it's too high for the legal sphere as well, for the same reason. If our courts insisted that all charges had to be proved beyond all possible doubt, then we would never convict anybody of anything. So the courts adopt a lower standard of proof, insisting that charges are proved beyond all reasonable doubt. And as we know, it's perfectly possible to meet that standard. In fact, it happens all the time. At least, that's the standard in criminal cases. In civil cases, though, a lower standard of proof applies, which is preponderance of evidence. In these cases, a verdict is reached on the basis of whichever side presents the greater weight of evidence. It's not a numbers game. The defense doesn't win just because it presents 8 pieces of evidence to the prosecution's 6, for example. No, instead, it's decided on the strength of the evidence. So the defense might offer 1 piece of really strong evidence, and the prosecution might offer 5 pieces of weak or circumstantial evidence, and the judge may decide that the defense's 1 piece of really strong evidence is enough to tip the balance in its favour. So in these cases, you just need to present evidence that tips the balance in your favour, such that the judge thinks it's more probable than not that you are right. Now, as I say, when Flue draws a comparison between his presumption of agnosticism and the legal presumption of innocence, it might give the impression that he thinks the same standard of proof applies in both. Namely, that the case should be proved beyond all reasonable doubt. But as it happens, that doesn't seem to be his position. Instead, he talks about theists and atheists making their position more or less probable. He doesn't explain what he means by that, but I suspect he's thinking of something like a preponderance of evidence, such that a belief is justified if and only if there is a preponderance of evidence in its favour. Now, in requiring either side to present a preponderance of evidence, Flew is actually setting the bar quite low, historically speaking. As we'll see in the next couple of weeks, the golden age for proofs of God's existence was the early modern period, so around the mid-17th to the mid-18th century. Back then, philosophers and theologians put forward proofs that they thought were capable of establishing God's existence beyond all reasonable doubt, or in some cases, of demonstrating God's existence beyond all possible doubt. And in fact, many thinkers back then took their proofs to be on a par with mathematical demonstrations. And the thinking was that anyone who encountered these proofs could not fail to accept their conclusion that God exists, so long as his or her rational faculties were intact. But even those who were not prepared to claim mathematical certainty for their proofs still took them to put God's existence beyond all reasonable doubt. And they had a nice way of putting this. They would say that their proofs gave a moral certainty of God's existence. A moral certainty isn't as high as logical or mathematical certainty, but it's the next best thing because it stems from a degree of probability that is so high as to leave no room for reasonable doubt. So 300 years ago, philosophers were apt to think of their proofs as either demonstrations, which offer mathematical or logical certainty of God's existence, or they would think of them as arguments that establish God's existence to such a high degree of probability that there was no scope for any reasonable doubt. In this, they were somewhat overconfident, as we know, and we might think that Flew is being a bit more realistic about the prospects for proving or disproving God's existence than people were hundreds of years ago. Because after all he requires is a preponderance of evidence one way or another, rather than anything stronger. And in this, he's much more in line with the way contemporary philosophers of religion look at the matter. So I'll give one example, and this is perhaps the best known attempt to establish God's existence in recent years. And that's Richard Swinburne's book, The Existence of God. It came out originally in 1979, and a second edition came out in 1991. Now, in this book, Swinburne considers and defends a whole raft of different proofs, from classic ones like the cosmological argument and the design argument, and he goes from those to less well-known proofs like the argument from providence. And he also considers arguments against God's existence, like the problem of evil. He then weighs up all of the evidence for and against and concludes that the probability that God exists is higher than the probability that he doesn't. Swinburne doesn't say that the probability of God's existing is much higher than his not existing, only that God's existence is more probable than not, as he puts it. And this looks to be precisely what Flew is demanding: a preponderance of evidence in favour of one side over the other. So the evidence doesn't have to establish its conclusion beyond all possible doubt, or even beyond all reasonable doubt. It just has to be stronger than the evidence for the other side. I should note, though, that ultimately what Swinburne has done in his book is not what Flew advocated with his presumption of agnosticism. It's true that Swinburne carefully considered the arguments for and against God's existence. But he did not do so from a position or presumption of agnosticism. Quite the opposite, in fact. Swinburne was a believer in God before he wrote his book and before he undertook his study of the arguments. So it might not come as much of a surprise that he ends up defending the very thing he believed beforehand. A sort of after-the-fact justification of a position that he already holds. Or perhaps it's better to say that what Swinburne was doing was trying to find ways of making his own view seem defensible or reasonable to others. But certainly he was not doing what Flew advocated, which is a personal investigation into the question of God's existence that begins with a presumption of agnosticism and then involves an examination of the evidence for and against. This, Flew suggests, is the right way to go about it. Okay, so I think that will do in terms of sketching out Flew's presumption of agnosticism. So what to make of it? Now I have to admit that when I first came across Flew's paper 20 or so years ago, I was very taken by it. It really resonated with me. And it continued to do so until a couple of years ago or thereabouts. And there are two reasons why I was so taken with it in those years that I was. So the first reason that his appeal for a presumption of agnosticism resonated with me was because it describes pretty accurately what I did back in my late teens and early 20s. Or what I think I did anyway. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, before I undertook any serious study of the arguments for and against God's existence, I neither believed nor disbelieved in God. Which sounds very much like Flew's presumption of agnosticism. Then I went to university, got interested in the God question, and that's when I started to act like the district court judge, weighing the evidence for and against, trying to come to a decision one way or another. And as I concluded that the evidence wasn't strong enough to decide either way, the whole process just confirmed me as an agnostic. But what matters here is the process, the procedure, which starts with a presumption of agnosticism and is then followed by the scrutiny of the evidence. So Flew's paper resonated with me because I thought it described pretty well the process I had followed. And obviously, it's always nice to find a heavyweight thinker supporting an approach you've already taken. And so Flew's paper made me feel vindicated. In effect, it was telling me, hey, I did the right thing after all. The second reason Flew's paper resonated with me is that the approach he advocated just seemed so intrinsically reasonable. And not just on the question of God's existence, but on any theoretical question. So take, for example, the question, is there life on Kepler 62e? I should explain. Kepler 62e is a planet discovered about a decade ago by observations made from the Kepler telescope. It orbits a star called Kepler 62, which is about 1200 light years away from our solar system. And its discovery got a lot of attention because it's considered to be a potentially habitable exoplanet. And that's because its orbit falls within the habitable zone of its host star, which means it could potentially have water, and that's considered vital, of course, for the development of life. Okay, but is it inhabited? Is there life there? Well, we don't know. One way or the other at the moment. The planet's just too far away for us to get to anytime soon, and our best telescopes can't see it, and we won't be able to for some time yet. So a definitive answer isn't available yet. And on the back of that, you might think the best approach to the question of whether there is life on that planet is something like Flu's presumption of agnosticism. In other words, that we start with an agnostic position, neither believing that there is life on that planet nor disbelieving it. And then we consider the evidence for and against, and ultimately pin our belief to whichever side has the best evidence. Or we just stay agnostic if we think that the current evidence doesn't allow us to decide either way. Starting with a presumption of agnosticism, it just seems right here. After all, we'd think it a bit odd, wouldn't we, if someone were to presume that there is life on that planet, or if they presumed that there isn't. We'd wonder why they would take that as their starting point. And in fact, I suspect we think something had gone a bit wrong with their approach. Why would anyone presume a positive answer over a negative one, or vice versa? On what basis? And just to be clear again, we're talking about the initial presumption here, the starting position. We're not dealing with those who've arrived at their belief after weighing up the evidence, but only with those who are inclined to say that there is or isn't life on that planet as their starting position before the evidence had been considered. So in this case, and many others, we'd probably feel that the presumption of agnosticism is the only one that makes sense. It just seems to smell right. If approaching a question where the answer isn't obvious, we start out not by presuming a yes, not by presuming a no, but by presuming neither. A don't know, if you like. We start without a commitment to a yes or no answer, and we stick with it until the evidence pushes us in one direction over the other. And I suspect we tend to think that we must have the right degree of credulity and incredulity so that we don't believe in something too easily or set up standards for belief that are so high that they cannot reasonably be reached. So that's the second reason Flu's approach resonated with me. It just struck me as reasonable to begin with a presumption of agnosticism in any question where an answer isn't obvious, whether it be God's existence, whether there's life on Kepler 62e, or whether there's dinosaur bones buried underneath my house, or whatever. But what about now? Do I still agree with Flu? Actually, no. In fact, I've had some misgivings about Flu's presumption of agnosticism for a while now. And that is despite him advocating pretty much the approach I took to the God question almost 30 years ago, and have continued to take ever since. So what's wrong with Flu's approach? In a nutshell, I think it's because it invites us, in fact it requires us, to treat the existence of God as a scientific hypothesis or intellectual quest. Or if I can put it another way, Flu's presumption of agnosticism assumes that God's existence is to be settled in the same way as one would settle a scientific question. Flu simply assumes that. He was wrong to do so, I now think, but I can understand why he did make that assumption. As you probably know, for many centuries, many theists have given the impression that theism can and should be looked at as a scientific hypothesis, as something that can be decided simply by weighing the available evidence. In medieval times, there was a line of thinkers who sought to demonstrate the truth of the Christian religion. And rather than plough straight in with a defense of the Bible or of the articles of faith, what they did was start with what they called a preamble to the faith, in which they sought to prove the existence of God. The idea here was that a belief in God's existence was logically prior to belief in his revelation. After all, the thinking goes, one must first believe there is a God before one can believe in his revelation. So, in order to show the truth of Christianity, one first had to show that there was such a thing as God, and then show that this God would reveal himself, and only then did one try to show that a particular revelation, like the one found in the Christian Bible, was the correct one. So, these attempts to prove Christianity started with this preamble to the faith, in which one sought to prove the existence of God. But these attempts to prove God's existence really took on a life of their own in the early modern period. And sometimes back then, these proofs served as preambles to the faith, exactly as they did in medieval times. But more often than not, they were simply presented as standalone proofs. And in early modernity, proving God's existence became almost something of an industry, with many different thinkers developing many different variations of many different proofs. And the whole enterprise continues to this day. New arguments for God and new twists on old arguments can be found in many books and journals. And this has given the impression that the existence of God is something to be decided in much the same way as any other question of philosophy, or better still, science. In other words, by the careful weighing of evidence. Atheist thinkers have tended to follow suit, developing a range of arguments against God's existence, and in so doing, giving the impression that one should approach the God question in the same way as we in the West would approach any other scientific hypothesis, by testing it out empirically and rationally. And Richard Dawkins is a good example of this. There's one paper in which he insists that religion is a scientific theory and should be approached as such. So given this long history of treating arguments for God's existence in this way, I can quite understand why Antony Flew would assume that God's existence is to be settled in the same way as one would settle a scientific question. But in spite of that, although I can understand it, I no longer believe it's a safe assumption to make. Now, I'll be upfront here. I'll admit I'm still trying to work this out in my head, so what I'm about to say should be treated as notes or a draft sketch rather than a firm view. So, with that in mind, why do I think it's not a safe assumption to suppose God's existence can be treated scientifically? Well, the main thing that worries me about this is that it treats God as just another item or thing in the universe, as something whose existence can be proved or disproved in much the same way as one would prove or disprove the existence of life on Kepler 62e, or whether there are dinosaur bones buried under my house. Such thinking, I feel, simply gets God wrong. To see this, consider how God has traditionally been understood, as transcendent, mysterious, unknowable, hidden, and beyond human comprehension. That characterization tells us that God would not be an object of our experience or an object of our reason. And yet, all of the arguments for and against are based on either experience and reason. And hopefully from that, it should be clear that there is something deeply problematic about all this. Now, such a God would clearly not just be another item or thing in the universe. Such a God would evidently be something very, very different from anything in the universe. And as such, we might reasonably expect that the empirical and rational tools that we have at our disposal would be pretty useless in establishing the existence or non-existence of such a being. These empirical and rational tools that we have, they serve us very well when they're used to make discoveries of things within the universe. But it's hard to see that they would be of much use if what we're seeking is, by definition, outside of the universe. After all, if we're talking about a being that is transcendent, unknowable, hidden, beyond human comprehension, then virtually by definition, there are not going to be empirical or rational grounds for its existence, and it would be rather odd if there were. And likewise, they're not going to be empirical or rational grounds against its existence either. And by seeking empirical and rational grounds that aren't there, the sort of arguments that have been developed for and against God's existence have succeeded only in sending us, theists, atheists, and agnostics alike, down the wrong path. So ultimately, the intellectual quest for God, like the one I conducted, and like the one that Flew recommended that we all conduct, now feels to me entirely misguided. It involves seeking empirical or rational evidence for something for which, according to the traditional conception, there can be no such evidence. So I would reject Dawkins' view that religion is a scientific hypothesis, and that God's existence or non-existence is a scientific question that can be settled in the same way as any other, by the weighing up of empirical or rational evidence. So now I just want to bring all this around to a conclusion and link it with Flew's presumption of agnosticism. So I would say that if God's existence is a scientific question, the sort of thing that could be decided simply by gathering and weighing evidence, then a presumption of agnosticism would be precisely the right approach to take. But if God's existence is not a scientific question, and I have suggested that it's not, then a presumption of agnosticism seems entirely misguided. For want of a better way to put it, to follow Flew's approach and adopt a presumption of agnosticism involves making the assumption, not a presumption, an assumption, that whether God exists or not is some kind of scientific hypothesis, the sort of thing that could be decided simply by gathering and weighing evidence. But this assumption, I've suggested, is unwarranted and entirely misguided. And this is because of what God is typically taken to be: transcendent, mysterious, unknowable, hidden, and beyond human comprehension. In other words, not the sort of thing for which we could or should expect there to be any empirical or rational evidence for or against. So what should we do? Or to put it another way, should we presume atheism, theism, or agnosticism? Well, the earlier me, the me of 25 years ago, would have agreed with Flew's answer that we should presume agnosticism. The me of today would reject that. And that's because the very act of presuming one position or another is a prelude to precisely the sort of rational investigation that I undertook, that Flew recommended we undertake, and that I now see as entirely misguided. The investigation involves using empirical and rational means to settle the question of whether God exists or not, despite the fact that pretty much by definition, God isn't reachable by these means. So, in my view, the investigation is just misguided. And since the question with which I started wrongly assumes that such an investigation is not misguided, I would say the question itself must be faulty. In other words, there's something highly problematic about asking whether we should presume atheism, theism, or agnosticism, since in doing that, we're wrongly assuming, I would say, that whatever presumption we make could eventually be overturned by evidence for or against. And for the reasons that I've given, I simply don't think that it could. So, where does this leave me and anyone else who followed Flu's lead, who presumed agnosticism and then examined the supposed evidence for or against God's existence? Well, unfortunately, that's a question to which I still have no answer.